Does any other members wish to be recognized for 5 minutes to discuss the amendment and the nature of the substitute? I recognize Mr. McKean for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request.
We'll let him go since I recognized him and then come back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ivey, I'm going to pick on you just for a minute because you're well reasoned. I listened to a lot of your debate, and I think it's I hear someone that's really stepping into what does the law say, what does the court proceeding say. And so I took note a while ago when you talked about that the Supreme Court, quote, has yielded to the executive what to enforce and how to enforce it. And I just step back as someone who does not have a Juris Doctorate, and I think about that. I just think about that statement for what to enforce and how to enforce it. For all of us that know that we did not have a king implemented in our governance, that's really what we're doing when we allow that ideology to be pervasive. To allow the executive on how to enforce it and what to enforce, you've granted them the ability to become a king, and that flies in the face of what all of us. I think that transcends party politics. We taught the Constitution. We do not have a king. And think about what John Adams said. John Adams, that great statement, he said, we are to be a government of law, not of men. What's he talking about? He's talking about the rule of law. Think about what his cousin, Samuel Adams, said, that neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest of laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are universally corrupt. So what we're talking about here, and don't you think it's quite ironic? We're going to go through these procedural hurdles all day long today. And I respect that. You have the right to use the rules and to bog this process down. But we're using the dot and tittle, making sure we adhere to it, and that will be respected by the chairman. But think about what we're doing. We're defending someone who refuses to adhere to the dots and tittles, who refuses to play by the rules. And so that Alanis Morissette song in my youth is coming up. Isn't it ironic, don't you think? This is about the rule of law in this country. And when we in a moment, when we move to a place to where we're willing to say that we're going to yield to the executive to determine what to enforce and how to enforce, regardless if they adhere to, they're not just violating the will of Congress, they're violating your congressional membership, because you are the voice of we the people. And when we pass laws and we have bureaucracies that don't follow it, guys, what are we up here for? What are we up here for other than to maintain a position? And I want to finally end with this. Jefferson has an incredible statement, Thomas Jefferson. And he writes this in 1820. And he says to this gentleman, he said, you, sir, are basically asserting that the judges are the ultimate arbitrator of all constitutional questions. Then he goes on to say, that is a dangerous doctrine indeed. And it would lead us to the despotism of an oligarchy. You know what despotism is? Because I had to look it up. It means absent the control of men. Why are we in the Constitution 3,000 words or 2,000 words and the executive is only 1,000 words? Because they understood the weight need to be left to the legislative body as the voice of we the people. It's a dangerous doctrine when the simplicity of this is we pass laws, they have to be followed, and then we have any ideology that creeps in and says, let them interpret how they want to. It's a dangerous doctrine indeed. And with that, I yield, Mr. Chairman.
What for a question?
The gentleman yields, so I think Mr. Magaziner wanted to make a UC request. For what purpose?
Chairman. Yeah, I do have a unanimous consent request to include George Washington's farewell address to the nation, in which he warned that unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and usurp for themselves the reins of government, as we have seen through this impeachment process. I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair is going to entertain all UC requests further from this point to insert items into the record at the end of our business today. I will not be recognizing members for that purpose at this time. And does anyone else want to make a comment? 5 minutes discussion on the amendment and the nature of the substitute. Mr. Ranking Member, you're recognized.
I yield my 5 minutes to Mr. Ivey.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Ivey, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for yielding. And to my colleague, I appreciate the comments, but But I would just remind my colleague that the portion that I read of the Supreme Court opinion addresses that directly. So we don't have kings, we have elections, and we have three branches of government. Usually the Supreme Court is the body that resolves the conflicts between the executive branch and the legislative branch. But as Justice Kavanaugh pointed out, in the event there's a political solution that needs to be pursued, and this goes back again to page 14 of the slip opinion of United States v. Texas, which is now part of the record. Congress possesses an array of tools to analyze and influence those policies. So in other words, if there's a policy dispute, Congress has tools like, and the justice continues, oversight, appropriations, the legislative process, Senate confirmations, and then they reference elections. So, the point with respect to whether this is a king or not, obviously it's not a king. I mean, this is 2024. We got a hotly contested presidential election coming up, I think by any measure. But the point for this particular issue is the Supreme Court said that there are these tools available. They do not mention impeachment. Justice Kavanaugh's opinion does not mention impeachment as a tool for resolving political dispute. And I think based on the other document I entered earlier, which goes to the maladministration piece, the point there is this isn't for policy disputes. You don't use impeachment for policy disputes because it could get out of control. So we want to make sure that we use it for very limited circumstances, and we've heard some of those as already.
Gentleman, yield for a question?
Yes.
Is one of the tools available to Congress to pass statutes limiting the discretion of the enforcement discretion of the administration?
Yeah, I think that's what Justice Kavanaugh meant by the legislative process.
Okay, right. So that's what Congress has done. That's what the court is dealing with in the Texas case. And the issue is whether or not the administration has flouted, brazenly disregarded those statutes limiting its discretion.
Just to reclaim.
So how does the Congress deal with the controversy over that?
Well, I think that's the point that he's trying to make with the other issues the other options that he lays out. But I'll point this out.
Is impeachment one of the options?
Not that he mentions here.
I'm asking you, sir.
This is an 8-1 decision. I think it was said to be 5-4 earlier. And the Supreme Court, the Trump wing of the Supreme Court, is in the majority and the concurrence on this. And the bottom line they're saying here is, even if you think these two statutes are mandatory, which by, I think, Mr. McCall's reading that they were, they're still saying that discretion belongs to the executive. And if I might yield to Mr. Magazine.
Because I want to speak on this point that raised by Mr. Bishop and Mr. Burkeen. One thing Congress could do is appropriate the funds for adequate detention capacity. Because what we're talking about here is the Secretary exercising his discretion because the capacity of the centers has been reached. So he is exercising his discretion as to who should be released and who should.
Would the gentleman
just
yield?
as, in 1 second, Chairman, respectfully, just as the prior administration and the administration before those did as well. Under the Trump administration, again, in the last 2 years, 52% of migrants in detention were released by the Trump administration because they were at capacity. Once again, the Secretary then was using his discretion under the Trump administration. The current Secretary is doing the same thing.
If the gentleman would yield, I want to point out that CoreCivic and the other company that do our ICE detention have been resoundingly filled with empty beds. If you go look at the numbers, as soon as Secretary Mayorkas took over, those ICE detention facilities, there's one in California they're going to shut because it's got 8 people and it holds 3,000. So I think I just want to correct the facts on that. The ICE detention beds have consistently been unfilled.
If I could just...
And I yield to Mr. Magaziner.
Yeah. Just real quick. Again, the DHS data shows that across the system that the detention centers across the system are at and above capacity, and the Secretary has the discretion to decide what to do about that, just as the prior. And again, the prior administration released people from detention as well, so how this would be impeachable and that wasn't is unclear.
If the gentleman would yield, he needs to yield back to you, and then you need to yield to the ranking member.
I yield back to the ranking member. I apologize.
It's to the ranking member, and time has expired. So,
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose?
I'd like to respond to my colleague's assertion about this being politically a political.
We got a queue. And I'll put your name down. The next up is Mr. Jimenez for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And look, somebody said that Republicans are businessmen and women, and Democrats are lawyers. Well, I'm neither. I'm neither a business person or an attorney. I'm actually just a firefighter, and I'm very proud to be a firefighter. But firefighters tend to look at things, kind of not so much shades of gray as maybe business people and attorneys do. And so, there's a raging fire happening at the border, and that was demonstrated to me pretty soon after the Biden administration took over. And as a firefighter, what you do is you try to put the fire out, and then you look for what caused the fire. Well, the fire in this case wasn't accidental; it was actually lit on purpose. And I've said that for a couple of years, not just now. I've said it for a couple of years. This was actually done on purpose. And the Biden administration, Secretary Mayorkas, are using policy to mask unlawful behavior. You can talk about policy all you want, but when that policy actually is unlawful behavior, it's unlawful behavior that we're talking about here. It's not a difference in policy. It's the unlawful behavior of the Biden administration and Secretary Mayorkas that has led to that fire that is putting America at risk. Not only is it putting America at risk, it's putting Mexico at risk too. Because the cartels that control the southern part of that border are being enriched by the policies, the unlawful policies of the Biden administration, to the tune of where they were making $500 million a year for illegal trafficking of human trafficking. Now they're making $1 billion a month, over $13 billion. And so the Secretary and the Secretary has always denied that there's a problem. Now even President Biden says, hey, we got a problem. So basically, like you said, Mr. Chairman, he threw him under the bus. But we've had witness after witness after witness saying, hey, we've told the Secretary what he had to do in order to stem the flow of illegal migration into the United States. And as my colleagues so demonstrated, that spike didn't happen during the Trump administration. It happened in February of 2021, right after President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas changed the policy, which was a clear violation of the law and clearly contrary to the will of this Congress. The only remedy that we have is impeachment. For the opposing side to say, no, we can't, it's discretion. So if we write a law that says, hey, you have to paint that thing blue, and they decide to do it red, and then, well, that's just discretion. No. When you violate the law, when you go contrary to the will of Congress, Congress must act, especially when failure to do so puts America at risk. And so, again, I see this very clearly. This fire was started by Secretary Mayorkas reversing policies that were working. It's his absolute discretion to change policy, but it's not his discretion to change policy when it violates the law. And that's what I do.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I won't, because actually I'm just going to yield my time back. Thank you very much.
Okay, the gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Titus for 5 minutes to discuss the amendment in the nature of substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to point out that some of those empty beds are due to COVID policies, and those guidelines went in under the Trump administration. You know, I've said before a quote that I thought really summed up these sham impeachment proceedings, and that came during a previous attempt, one of the very, very few, to impeach acting Secretary of Labor Louis Post. They failed at that, and history repeats itself. That, too, was a disagreement over immigration policy. Mr. Post described those efforts as mental dullness at high tension. Well, I think that really describes what we're seeing today, mental dullness at high tension. These articles have no basis in law, not in the Constitution. Of course, Ms. Taylor Greene said several times in previous testimony, we're not talking about the Constitution here. Well, that's pretty obvious. Or in precedent. In the high tension part, we've seen our colleagues across the aisle on TV, pontificating, Fox News, fundraisers. Certainly that is high tension. But you know what? I bet our founding fathers are just rolling over in their graves as they hear some of the interpretations of what they said and did at the Constitutional Convention, citing Mason as though that provision actually went into the Constitution. No, it didn't. Selectively citing Madison and not looking at Federalist Papers that came later to explain the Constitution. Surely they would be appalled were they here. Something else, I keep hearing this is what the American people want. The American people want us to do this. I've not seen any polling numbers that show where the American people want us to impeach Mayorkas. They want us to solve the problem at the border, which we have a number of opportunities to do. There are several bills in this committee we could be looking at, some involving fentanyl. You've got the Senate compromise that may be coming over here. You've got the budget that came out of the president's office to increase resources. That's what the polling shows. The public wants us to deal with the border, not to impeach Mayorkas. I mean, how many members of the public could actually name Mayorkas as the chairman or the secretary of Homeland Security? This is also demoralizing the people who work for the DHS. Y'all tout these trips you took to the border. Well, we've all been to the border. You talked to one or two people. We've talked to others. We had testimony. The people at the border need the resources. That's what they are telling us consistently. So, I think that what we're doing here has serious consequences for the Constitution, for our democracy, for the people who are working at the border, who are on the front lines, and all for you to have some kind of political stunt, I think. And as Mr. Higgins will know, he's a fellow Southerner, I think another saying appropriately describes what's going on here, and that's just shoveling the same old shit and calling it sugar. And that's not what the people want us to do. So I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Ms. Lee for 5 minutes to discuss the ANS.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on that note, here we are again, subjected to the characterizations of House Democrats who attack the purpose and the validity of this hearing, who have today referred to it as a waste of time, a sham, a joke, a political game, a policy dispute, and even said that no serious member would pursue these articles of impeachment. In fact, Mr. Chairman, the opposite is true. No serious member could sit in this room and look at the American people and deny the catastrophe at our southern border. No serious member could deny that it is past time for accountability. No serious member could look at the American people and say that lawlessness is acceptable, that it is acceptable for one branch of government to defy the others willfully, purposefully, and with impunity. And that is precisely what Alejandro Mayorkas has been doing all of this time. Mr. Mayorkas has indeed defied, first, the courts of the United States of America. Of course, these matters have been litigated. Of course, the states are fighting for safety of their citizens, for the security of our borders. And what has he been told? Courts have ruled that his subversion of the parole process, his use of that as a way to get around the laws of the United States is unlawful. He's been ordered to desist. He did not. He's been ordered to reinstate remain in Mexico. He did not. He's come to this Congress and he's given testimony before us that was demonstrably false, stating that our border was secure, stating that he had operational control of the border, when in fact, every person in this room, and I dare say the vast majority of America, knows that is not the truth. He has misled this committee. He has misled the American people. This process, this committee's process in consideration of this day has been methodical, it has been serious, it has been thoughtful. We have heard from the men and women of local law enforcement. We have heard the catastrophic and tragic effects to their communities that this failure to enforce our laws has caused. We heard from families who have lost their children, deaths from fentanyl poisoning. We've heard the tragic stories of human trafficking, not only of Americans, but of those who are crossing this border illegally that are being exploited. We have heard these stories week after week. And rather than call them a waste of time, as our Democrat colleagues have done, we need to hear them, we need to heed them, and we need to take action. Because here is the reality. Every single day that Secretary Mayorkas continues in his role, America is less safe. We have ceded control of our border to the Mexican drug cartel, and we have seen the tragic and irrecoverable consequences of doing so. Not only are these articles of impeachment appropriate and based in law, it is our duty to ensure that the United States of America is a nation of law. It is our duty to ensure that our border is secure. And it is our duty to ensure that Secretary Mayorkas faces the consequences of his actions and the consequences of deliberately and willfully creating this catastrophe. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Ms. Ramirez for 5 minutes to discuss the ANS.
Thank you, Chairman Green. Before I go into my remarks, I do want to ask unanimous consent to include in the record Hines, President of the House of Representatives, on the last impeachment of Cabinet Secretary William Belknap in 1876.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Mr. Chair, I wanted to ask unanimous consent to include in the record Hines, President of the House of Representatives, on the last impeachment of a Cabinet Secretary, William Belknap, that happened in 1876.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. So, I agree with my colleague who just spoke a moment ago. I want to see action as well. I think many of us coming in here, particularly those that came as freshmen, we came from our districts and we told our constituents that we were going to go to Congress. In some cases, some of us came from state legislatures because we wanted to carry on and build on the work we did in the state legislature and get things done. So as I address today, I do it with a deep sense of urgency. And I got to admit, frustration. As we find ourselves amidst a political spectacle that threatens to overshadow the critical issues facing our nation at the border. There are issues at the border. But the call for the impeachment of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas is not only misguided, but it also distracts us from finding natural and practical policy solutions to the humanitarian crisis within our borders. For more than 17 hearings, and for those of you that have been here through all of these hearings, we've heard colleagues on the other side of the aisle talk about how worried they are about the open borders and how it's hurting our communities. Once in a while, some of our colleagues have even mentioned it hurts asylum seekers. Yet instead of working on solutions to these horrible and painful realities, Republicans continue using our pain for their political theater. My colleagues say they care about the pain of our communities. I've heard them say it. They care so much that back in January 18th, they brought mothers who lost their children just to parade their pain in front of cameras. Republicans lied to those mothers and told them that Secretary Mayorkas was going to be present during the hearing. Even when they had knowledge that he was not going to be here, he had asked for a date that was agreeable for the committee and him. They knew he wasn't going to be here, but they told him he would be. My colleagues say they care about thousands of migrants fleeing their homes, dying in the Rio Grande, and being inhumanely denied asylum, yet they celebrate draconian laws that are put in place by Republican governors. See, folks, there's dissonance between what you say and what your actions are. Instead of solutions, we're working on a basis impeachment, and we know that impeachment is a solemn and consequential action reserved for egregious offenses that undermine the very fabric of our democracy. The charges against Secretary Mayorkas of willful and systemic refusal to comply with the law and breach of public trust lack the substance required for such a drastic measure. So let us refrain from allowing political posturing to supersede the crucial work ahead. In hopefully a few moments or hours, I am going to give you an opportunity to take action by some of the amendments I'm going to introduce that actually get to border security and actually get us to address the issues of those that are already here. I want to implore each committee member to rise above the political theatrics and commit to the severe work our constituents are expecting of us. Let's stop weaponizing people's pain. Let's end this theater. Let's get to work and find policy solutions that reflect the compassion and values we hold as representatives of the American people.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes, I do.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate your passionate words, which are, of course, true. I wanted to just respond, because I know my colleagues don't want me to speak during their time, to a couple of the confusing arguments that I've been hearing. On the one hand, you hear that Secretary Mayorkas should not have changed the policies of the Trump administration. But if he is changing the policies of the Trump administration, that means it's a policy decision, not a violation of the law. Now, you can then argue, as I'm sure you would, that, oh no, it's the policies that are violating the law. But you can't show that any of his policies are actually violating the law. You don't like them. You disagree with them. You don't like humanitarian parole. But there are specific case-by-case evaluations done of every single person.
The gentlelady's time is yielded.
So maybe you ought to figure out exactly what your argument is.
And the gentleman is not recognized. Forward. I now recognize Mr. Strong for 5 minutes of comment about the ANS.
Thank you. I want to respond to my colleague's assertion about this being a political exercise. Anyone running for president has plenty to run on. You think about it. Economy, high interest rates, affordable housing, Afghanistan evacuation, fentanyl overdoses, $34 trillion national debt, loss of energy independence, use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, crime rates, failure to spend to respond to Iranian attacks on U.S. troops, selling influence by the Biden family, cocaine found in the Biden West Wing, grocery prices up by 17 to 21% on every American, gas and energy costs through the roof for all Americans, and the Democrat push for EV vehicles on Americans. You look at it, over 8.3 million illegal border crossings, over 7 million encounters at the southern border, 474,046 unaccompanied minors, 2.3 million migrants released at the border, 1.8 million known gotaways, 57,555 pounds of fentanyl seized by CBP at the southern border, 361 individuals whose name appear on the terrorist watch list were stopped trying to cross the U.S.-Mexico border between ports of entry, including 19 in December. 40% of the catch and release migrants have disappeared, according to DHS. Over 100,000 encounters every single month. 13 billion is estimated cartel profits in 2021 just off human smuggling. 40% increased in encounters at the border since FY 2021 and 370% since 2020. Of the 300,000 children that HHS placed with sponsors or family members in the U.S., more than 85,000 have gone missing as of July 2023. The smuggling of children to America to be sex slaves, I promise immigration, is the number one issue facing America. But there's a laundry list of failures. You look, the Secretary of Homeland Security failed to comply with U.S. law. The answer is clear: end the catch and release, cease the exploitation of parole authority, reinstate remain in Mexico, expand, expedite, and removal authority, and renew building the wall. The core mission of DHS is to ensure a homeland that is safe, secure, and resilient against terrorism and other potential threats. No one on this dais believes America is safe, secure, or resilient against terrorism or other threats. Just this month, 10 retired FBI leaders and counterintelligence experts who together served under 7 different presidents sent a letter to Congress January the 17th about the dire threat that Mayorkas border crisis has brought to the U.S. They wrote in part, it would be difficult to overstate the danger represented by the presence inside our borders of what is comparatively a multi-division army of young single adult males from hostile nations and regions whose background intend to do damage to America. You think about it, they're not just coming from a couple of different countries. They're coming to America from 160 different countries. They're flying into Mexico to come across, and they're coming from everywhere in this world. It is unacceptable, and I'll promise you the people of America have had all they can stand. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Payne for 5 minutes to discuss the ANS.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I strongly oppose the articles of impeachment offered by the majority here today. Let's talk about the majority's motivations to bring these articles to be marked up. They claim it's about law and order. However, the 2 articles we are considering today fail to meet the bar of Article 2, Section 4 of the United States Constitution. This little document set the basis for our democracy. This document here. At times I wonder if some of you have even looked at this. But if need be, I can have one sent to your office. Article 2, Section 4 states the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for conviction of treason. Is there any indication that Secretary Mayorkas has committed treason? Bribery. Has there been any indication that Secretary Mayorkas has accepted money for illegals coming across the border? High crimes and misdemeanors. Nothing applies in Section 2. And you can continue to dismiss it in the Constitution. It's interesting how we can ignore the Constitution at times, but then when it presents itself to your need, that you cite it. The accusations levied against Secretary Mayorkas in these articles amount to nothing but more than policy disagreements. Then let's work on policy. Let's work on policy. If there's a problem, let's give Secretary Mayorkas the tools that he needs. But you're unwilling. The Senate Republicans are willing to work with it, but you got the dictator for one day telling you not to go along with it. There simply isn't anything regarding treason, bribery, or high kinds of misdemeanors. In his role, Secretary Mayorkas has carried out his duties and responsibilities with unwavering dedication to the public trust. Now, you may disagree with that. So then let's have that discussion. Let's work on the policy that will make it better. He has not broken the law, and he has not done the best he can to keep order, given the tools that the majority has provided him with in terms of resources and tools to humanely address the issues along the southern border. It is not about the law and order then maybe it's about policy. As Democrats, we have laid out over the past few hearings, impeachment is a political tool that will fail to solve any issues that requires a policy-based solution. Once Mayorkas is gone, does that mean everything is okay? Is that the real issue? Or do problems persist? This is nothing more than a political stunt on an issue that requires a serious policy solution. Building a wall with taxpayer dollars is not a serious policy solution. Closing our borders in an attempt to ensure no immigrants seeking asylum comes in is not a serious policy solution. Starving our Border Patrol personnel of resources they need to protect the homeland is not a serious policy solution. We should come together and find reasonable, humane, and equitable proposals to address this complex issue and put forth a serious policy solution that upholds our values as a country and a society. Instead, we have Chairman Green and Marjorie Taylor Greene and the other members on the majority seem to believe impeaching Senator Mayorkas.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Is an action that will fix
the gentleman is not recognized. I now recognize Mr. Gonzalez for his 5 minutes of discussion.
I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman. And, one of the best things about Congress is we all represent districts from across the country and we have debate. And I think that's very positive. One of the most difficult things about Congress is it's filled with nothing but lawyers, and they'll talk all day about this, that, or the other, which is, I think, frustrating to many Americans. This is what's going to happen. The House of Representatives is going to impeach Secretary Mayorkas, and there is absolutely nothing anyone can do to stop it. That's going to happen. In my district, in Texas, we're feeling this. In Arizona, they're feeling it. In California, they're feeling it. There is not one district in America that is not impacted by this border crisis. So I would like to focus on what happens next. What are we going to do after that? What are we going to do? Are we going to have a conversation on how we secure the border? Are we going to continue to blame others for everything that's wrong? I would like to see this border secure in a manner that protects everybody. And I do think there's an opportunity to do that. And I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to come up with a conclusion that makes America on the track of keeping people safe and secure. With that, Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I don't have anybody else in the queue. Is there anyone else who would like to? Mr. Thenadar, have you had? I don't think you have had 5 minutes yet, have you? Okay. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to discuss the ANS.
Thank you, Chairman Green. And I would yield my time to the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Thenadar. Funny that members of Congress would want to focus on the law, given that our job is to write the laws, interpret the Constitution, and implement and pass laws. Crazy to have so many lawyers here when we're dealing with laws every day. And unfortunately, what we don't have is anyone on the other side of the aisle that seems to understand what a high crime and misdemeanor is. Now, I know that's part of the law, so you don't want to talk about it, but it is the requirement for impeachment. Now, we agree on a lot of things that have been said today, as surprising as that may be. The situation at the border is untenable. Migration patterns have dramatically changed over the last 5 years. It started in the middle of President Trump's administration as migrants were coming more and more to the border. Not every single person who came over the border without documents was deported under the previous administration. And in fact, that has never happened. So if you are going to impeach Secretary Mayorkas because you say that he fails to adhere to the letter of the law under operational control, then you better impeach every single Secretary of Homeland Security that was during the past 5 administrations and will be going forward, because it's an impossible standard with the resources that they have. We have not increased the resources that the Department of Homeland Security needs to actually stop every single person from coming over the border. So I hear a lot of other things about different ways. I'm sorry, Mr. Pfluger, but you did not yield to me, so I will continue. I will mention one thing, though, you say, Mr. Pfluger. You mentioned the horrific story of 53 people who died effectively by heat and suffocation south of San Antonio, which is absolutely horrible. And if you had evidence that Secretary Mayorkas was working with the driver of that truck who abandoned them and left them there, then you would definitely have good evidence of an impeachable offense. But the notion that you would say that the cabinet secretary who oversees 260,000 employees is somehow willfully and intentionally responsible for that single incident is preposterous. Secretary Mayorkas has not disregarded any court order. Not one. Not one. Certainly he wasn't ordered to return the Remain in Mexico policy, as one of my colleagues said. He has not defied any court order. You have gone to the courts to try to prevent him from doing his job. That is true. And there have been judges who have entered preliminary orders in support of you. Those have been stayed. So he has adhered to the law in every single way that he's been required to do. Ultimately, as Mr. McCall said at the very beginning, what you are upset about is that Secretary Mayorkas rescinded prior executive orders that were working. And you have a right to be upset about that. And you have a right to talk about that. And you have a right to express your dissatisfaction in any way you choose. And you have a right to make that case to the American people so that they vote Secretary Mayorkas and this president out of office in November if that's ultimately what the people believe. But you do not have a right to demean this institution, to bastardize the impeachment clause of the Constitution, to belittle the standard of constitutional impeachment to such a degree that you can't even produce a legal memo in support of your articles of impeachment that do not exist in history and do not exist in the law. And if, in fact, as you allege here, there were false statements made to Congress or obstruction of Congress, those are crimes. You could have charged him with those, but you didn't want to because you knew you couldn't actually prove them. You just want to make the allegations and concoct some crazy breach of public trust which does not exist.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Tanadar, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Bishop for 5 minutes to discuss the ANS.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to have the opportunity to take issue with the gentleman from New York. But before I do, on the foundations of impeachment and why it's appropriate in this case, I think I ought to talk about what the news is, because there's not much news about these articles of impeachment. We've been moving toward this process with great deliberation and in open. This committee has, on the leadership of Chairman Green, for months. It's not a surprise to anyone. Let me tell you what the news is. The news is that Mr. Goldman just said that the situation at the border is untenable. The news is that on January 20th, the President of the United States, when asked by White House correspondent Jackie Heinrich if the U.S.-Mexico border is secure, he said, "No, it's not." He said, "I haven't believed that for the last 10 years, and I've said it for the last 10 years. Well, as we hear many members on the other side hold forth about supposed hypocrisy over here, I got to tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. We've been saying the same thing this entire administration from the beginning, from January 2021, when the president disposed of multiple policies at the border that had been the most successful in history for containing illegal immigration, rejected them wholesale. And ever since, members of this committee on the other side have been trumpeting how successful this has been. It's been great. There's not a problem at the border. Chairman Green has materials released that, and if you count them up, 32 statements by the Secretary of Homeland Security asserting that the border is secure and that we have operational control of the border. A couple of examples. March 2021, I want to repeat my assurance to our audience this morning that the border is in fact secure. September 2021, Senator Ron Johnson, you have repeatedly stated that our borders are not open, they are closed. Do you honestly believe that our borders are closed? Mayorkas, Senator, I do, and let me speak to that. In July 2022, to ABC's Martha Raddatz, just a simple question, do you think it's working? Mayorkas, I think we are doing a good job. Me, November 2022, Secretary Mayorkas, do you continue to maintain that the border is secure? Mayorkas, yes. Goes on, 32 times. Until suddenly Mr. Goldman says, and others have said it here today, it's not tenable. Maybe it was because Eric Adams from New York said, you're destroying New York City. Maybe it's because the mayor of Chicago said, you got to send us more money. We're in crisis over here. Or Denver, or any of a number of other Democrat-run cities. That's the news. That's the news. This impeachment, these articles of impeachment present a very narrow question, which no one seems to want to follow the line of reasoning long enough to get to. What the Supreme Court said in United States versus Texas, both the majority and the dissent, is that Congress, 20 years ago, mandated restriction of the administration's prosecutorial authority. In certain specific cases, you will detain, and detain until you have removed. And yes, Secretary Mayorkas has brazenly flouted and disobeyed those laws. Those statutory laws. He wrote guidelines that said it shall not be a basis to detain anyone if they're in those, just because they're in those categories that Congress declared in law. So that's what's happened over and over again. The articles of impeachment specify 7 separate statutory commands by the Congress that Secretary Mayorkas has similarly flouted and brazenly disobeyed. And I ask the question, if someone wants to take it up, if the Congress does not impeach, what indeed is the remedy?
I'd love to take it up.
I'm going to
legislation.
I'll pose it. I've got 37 seconds, and you'll have plenty of time to address it. I'd be glad to have the colloquy. But what is the remedy? Well, Justice Alito made it clear in the dissent what the remedy is. Congress can impeach. Yes, Congress could do something else. Congress could cut off the money. But there are limits to what Congress can do. You can beg the question whether Congress has any power to restrict the discretion of the executive. The Supreme Court seems to think that it does, but it has said we are not the forum to vindicate those restrictions. That's what this process is about. It is about vindicating the rule of law in our constitutional system.
The gentleman yields. We are now up against votes, so we are going to recess until 15 minutes after the last vote. There are 2 votes.